All right, we are going to head and get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Reef Resilience webinar, Making Sense of Wild Seafood Supply Chains. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jeremy Rude, and I am a fisheries specialist for the Nature Conservancy's Global Ocean Program, and your host for today's webinar. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Today's webinar will be 1 hour, a 45-minute presentation followed by a question and answer session facilitated by Petra McGowan, the Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy's Reef Resilience Program. There are 2 ways participants can ask questions. The first is to use the question box anytime throughout the webinar to send questions, and we will keep track of these for the end of the presentation. Or simply raise your hand during the question portion of the webinar, and Petra will take your question during that time. You can raise your hand by clicking on the small hand icon on the toolbar on the left of your name. If you are having technical difficulties, such as hearing or seeing the slides, you can send us a message via the chat box and we'll try our best to resolve the issue. I would now like to introduce and welcome today's presenter. Dr. Mara Hart is a research director at Future of Fish, a nonprofit that provides research, design, and business services to organizations and entrepreneurs accelerating sustainability and traceability in seafood supply chains. Mara leads Future of Fish's discovery processes, where she conducts qualitative research and synthesis to identify patterns, barriers, and principles of success within complex systems. In addition to her supply chain primer she wrote for the Nature Conservancy, her past research projects have produced valuable insights into the global industry for wild seafood, aquaculture, oyster reef restoration, traceability, and storied fish. Mara earned her PhD in marine science from Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Thank you for joining us. I will now pass it over to Mara to begin the presentation.
Hi there, Jeremy. Thank you. And on behalf of Future of Fish, thanks to all of the Reef Resilience Network for having us to speak about this exciting topic today. Making sense of wild seafood supply chains is definitely close to our heart and something that we've been engaged in for quite a while. So I'm excited to be able to present to all of you and then to engage in some discussion at the end. So before I begin talking about the supply chain, though, I thought I'd give a little bit of background on Future of Fish and who we are. And we are a small nonprofit, and we provide research, design, and business services to innovators and entrepreneurs who are working to build a sustainable fisheries future. And we do this by trying to facilitate positive change through collaborative work. So that's bringing together all of the great innovators that are out there, and there are many I know who are listening right now through the Reef Resilience Network, and trying to help understand how we can work together to push on the different levers of change that we see that we think will affect greater positive impact for more sustainable fisheries in the future. And we began working in the fish space back in 2008 when we took a deep dive into the global seafood supply chain by conducting about 180 interviews and also going into the field with anthropologists, where we actually shadowed different members of the seafood supply chain across fishers and fish farmers, as well as in the mid-chain and at the consumer level, so that we could really try to understand the decision-making that was going on and the different behaviors and practices that were influencing the outcomes of fisheries on the water, as well as the way that seafood was bought and sold. And we did this over 4 countries, and we really started to understand how things work within seafood supply chains, and also how particular decisions were being made and how that decision-making was then influencing the long-term sustainability for fisheries management. So to kind of summarize all of that experience and research into one problem statement, it sort of looks like this, which is basically that the seafood industry, as it's currently structured right now, does not tend to reward responsible behaviors and practices. And oftentimes, the way it's structured actually incentivizes irresponsible practices. So whether that's environmental or social or just poor business practices. And all of this kind of structural imperfections lead to a bunch of consequences that we're all struggling to deal with. These include things like mislabeled products, So this is where the wrong data is attached to a seafood product. So the wrong species name, or perhaps the wrong location of catch or type of harvest method. There's fraudulent practices, and the difference here is that fraud is intentional. So this is where someone is purposefully swapping a fish or shellfish to try to either gain a premium price, perhaps by sneaking in a lower quality fish for one of higher quality, or changing the origin, or sometimes it is just simply trying to fulfill an order. You run out of the species that your client wants, so you try to fill the box with whatever you've got lying around. We also know that there's illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. So this is known as IUU fishing. And product that comes out of fisheries that don't have any management in place, or don't report their catch, or are illegally fishing, is very easily slipped into the legitimate supply chain because of some of the structural problems, in particular the fact that data does not flow well in seafood supply chains, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But because most of the fish that travels through global seafood supply chains can be thought of as mystery fish, it does not have good information attached to it, it allows for these illegal practices and illegitimate product to make its way into the legitimate supply chain. And all of this then drives the overfishing and decline of wild fish stocks that we see, because we don't have a way of trying to disincentivize those players who are acting poorly and making decisions that harm the environment, and we don't have a way of rewarding those who are actually trying to make the changes. So some of what we're trying to do at Future of Fish is to work on a strategy that says that the supply chain can actually be a source of solution as much as they are currently a source of problems. And part of this is because businesses that have good data actually benefit. There are business wins that are associated with better traceability and better traceability information. And of course, that information can then feed back into improving fisheries management. The supply chain is also a huge market driver. It can incentivize better practices and more responsible practices through everything such as more secure contracts or price premiums, better market access. These are all different mechanisms by which, if we can get the values of the supply chain to align with more responsible practices, we can help drive the better behaviors that we're looking for to create change on the water. But to do this really requires that we engage in supply chains in ways that work with rather than against the existing values. It's very, very difficult to change someone's value structure. Instead, what you can do is change the conditions and the incentives around which they're operating and design the system differently so that they are making decisions that are in alignment with more responsible fisheries practices, simply because that's now what makes sense given their current values. So that's the strategy behind which we try to engage with different folks in seafood supply chains to create change. And sort of the philosophy behind that is that at Future of Fish, we really try to take a systems view of the problem. And when you're considering something as big as overfishing or as complex as the seafood industry and seafood supply chain is, you have to consider that there is no one single solution. There's no one initiative or one program that can be launched within a fishery that's going to result in a supply chain shift that will lead to a perfect solution. Instead, there's going to be multiple challenges that all need to be addressed simultaneously. And that's the way that we can create change. And what's really neat with the TNC Reef Resilience Network that you're all a part of is that you're in a fantastic position to collaborate and share learnings and also share implementation strategies so that you can coordinate this kind of multi-pronged attack in order to try to shift the system. So multiple players that have the same mindset and the same goals can utilize your different skill sets and expertise to engage in supply chains sort of in a coordinated fashion so that we can start to push on all of these different levers that I'll be talking about today to create change across the global industry. So I think it's a really exciting time, and we're really thrilled that we were invited to work with TNC to create this primer as sort of a first step. And by primer, it's basically an introductory guide. And the idea behind this work was to create a document that could introduce folks to the way supply chains were structured and how they function, and how we can start to think about effective engagement strategies so that we can start to use supply chains to help create greater forces for change on the water that can lead to more long-term sustainable fisheries management. And the truth is, the practice of engaging in supply chains for fisheries benefits is a relatively nascent field, and it's evolving very rapidly. And this primer is an attempt to capture the current landscape and help those looking to understand and engage. But I'd like everyone to consider this as sort of the version 1.0. So part of what we hope to do today is to hear back from all of you about what resonates, where you are stuck, other innovations that you might be aware of or strategies that you're implementing, and to really continue to move this conversation forward so that we can expand the toolbox and understanding of how we can more effectively leverage supply chains for these long-term management wins. So I'm going to go through now different aspects, kind of highlighting the key findings from the report, but just so you all know, the full report is available online, and I welcome any questions at the end that you may have as we go through, and invite you all to, engage in the discussion we'll have after I walk through some of these key findings. All right, so let's start at the beginning. What is a supply chain? And the simplest definition is a supply chain just represents the process of getting a product from the producer to the consumer. And in fisheries, the producer can be either the fisher, if we're talking about wild supply chains, or it can be the fish farmer in aquaculture. Then you have a middleman or middlemen, and this may be a buyer or a trading partner that handles transactions. In artisanal fisheries, often this is the person who receives a product dockside and then passes it along. There's then a processor, and this is the person or business that actually performs the seafood processing. So this can include heading, gutting, scaling, deboning the fish, shucking the shellfish, holding crustaceans in live tanks. So it can be multiple processors, which can exist within the supply chain as well. So sometimes you can have one business that serves one function and then they pass it along to another. So you can have a primary processor, a secondary processor, and so on. There are also players known as wholesalers, and this is the person or business that tends to purchase the seafood for the purpose of resale to another business. So they really act in the middle of the chain, and risk of seafood fraud tends to be high at this level because spoilage, waste, and other problems can tend to drive some dishonest practices here. Retailer is the person at the end. So this is the business that sells the seafood to the consumer, whether it is in a grocery store outlet or can also be a restaurant, as opposed to another business or wholesaler. So this is a basic supply chain as we see it. But of course, the reality looks a little bit different. The word supply chain is highly misleading because it really is much more of a web. And if we dive in here, this is an example of an artisanal fishery in Kenya. And what we can see from this is that the same fisher may sell into completely different supply chains on any given day, depending on their catch. It can also depend on which supply chain they sell into, dependent upon which middlemen or dealers show up at the beach or the dock that day. So there are many conditions that can shift where a product winds up. So in this one, what happens is depending on whether the catch is low value or high value, it'll go through different buyers and distributors to local market access, to local markets, or it will move into higher level processing and go to an export market or high-end markets. So there are several paths the product can take. They can be short or long, or multi-step routes that can make tracking and tracing the product really difficult, especially for those in artisanal fisheries and local markets. This tends to be a huge challenge where the deals tend to be a little bit more informal and there may be no paper trail related to them at all. So despite all of these complexities, there are a couple basic characteristics of wild seafood supply chains that make them unique compared to other supply chains around the world. And some of these characteristics that we'll walk through real quickly here that are important to keep in mind. Probably the most important is the unpredictable supply. So pretty much unlike most supply chains in the world, fishers have no idea what or how much they will necessarily catch on any given day. And this means that the mid-chain players are faced with a constant juggling between what the supply can be, what the providers can supply, and what the consumers actually are demanding and what their customers are demanding. Seafood is also highly perishable. You have to move this product, or you have to have the infrastructure of cold storage, freezers and ice to be able to preserve it. So spoilage is a major issue, and it puts a lot of stress on the system because, especially again for fishers in the mid-chain, they cannot hold this inventory for very long. They've really got to move it along. It's low profit margin. We're talking cents on the pound, and this means that it is a volume-driven type of an industry. So this allows very little room for error. It also allows very little room for creativity and innovation. Disassembly. So this is where one fish is broken down into many different fillets or parts. Can be very difficult to track. So you start with one product and it then splits into many that can enter different aspects of the supply chain or different supply chain pathways. But then we also have aggregation, where we're getting fish from many different fishing boats that are then all brought together into big bundles to move forward, especially through commodity markets, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So you have both the disassembly of an individual product, but then you also have the grouping up of lots of individual products or individual batches from different locations all together. And that can make tracking and following product really difficult, which is why overall there's very minimal product tracking in seafood. What is done, the majority of which is still on paper, and most of the information from the origin of the catch to the harvest method, many of the factors that are most important for fisheries management, and especially sustainable fisheries management, is lost in the supply chain because it's not considered critical information. The fact that seafood has a global market and global demand is also pretty unique and creates different challenges. As a global market, it means that there's a disconnect between what the ocean is providing and what folks are demanding on the other side of the world. It also means that these chains can be very long and winding as seafood is shuttled around the globe. So basically, we have these different characteristics that define seafood supply chain, but there are some structures that we can look at that can really help to kind of break this all down and give you a little bit more insight into how this is all working. So when we think about the structures, we can simplify and say, okay, well, every supply chain starts with a producer and it ends with an end buyer who sells to the consumer. Where seafood supply chains really get funky is in the middle. So in general, the more steps in the middle of the supply chain, the more complex the tracking and tracing of the good, and the more likelihood of data loss, of fraud, of mislabeling, and some of the other woes. Shorter does not always mean better or more trustworthy. So that's really important to consider, but it can make the tracking and tracing a little bit easier. Given all this complexity, though, there are some key attributes that are common within many, if not most, artisanal supply chains. And we're going to focus on those today as ways of trying to break down and understand what types of supply chains you may all be engaging with within your own fisheries. And understanding these key attributes can really help inform strategic decision making, because it can help you identify what is the best approach for a supply chain intervention that is aligning with those incentives for responsible fisheries. We want to make sure, again, that we understand what is happening within a supply chain at all the different levels, or as many of those levels as we can, so that when we design an engagement or an initiative or a way to try to work with the businesses in the supply chain, we're doing so, again, in alignment with their values, but in a way that is shifting the behaviors and practices so that we can encourage and incentivize those more responsible behaviors to move forward. So here's some of the key attributes that can help us to sort of refine those strategies and hone in on how we can do this. So these are the things that all supply chains tend to have aspects of. So there's a type of product, and we'll talk about the different types of products that flow through seafood supply chains. There's the level of brand presence. So this is how much influence does a particular company within that supply chain have over the other companies. There are the relationship dynamics, the way that the relationships are structured among the different members in the supply chain. There's the amount of consolidation. So this is how many different companies and entities are you actually dealing with versus a more integrated supply chains. We'll talk about that. And also then the market access. So now I'll dive into each of these in more detail. So when it comes to type of product, there's a spectrum that moves from commodity to differentiated. In a commodity product, you can think of basically that every unit, whether it's an individual fish or fillet or a value-added product, they're all treated identically. There's no differentiation or differentiating information between these units. And so the decisions regarding buying and selling products are focused only on price. These are high volume products and they're highly aggregated products. So these are things such as whitefish, like cod or tuna or crab. On the other end of the spectrum are highly differentiated products. So these are those which are distinguished from one another based on some sort of specific information. That can be where they're harvested, the fishing method, the community, it can be a certification status or a brand. So in general, purchasing decisions around highly differentiated product are driven first by quality and then by price. So both of those factors factor in, and normally they can be equally factored in, but sometimes quality can even trump price. And that's in stark contrast to, again, the commodity, which is based solely on price. So there's different ways that product can be differentiated, but it tends to be based on geography or different product qualities, such as types of graded products by size or quality. Can also be sustainability, again, the certification status. There can also be differentiation based on the type of vessel, so the type of catch, so batches of product from like a single landing or a single net haul, as well as down to the individual fish. This, so again, tends to be higher value species that are typically tagged with some sort of unique code that allows them to be distinguished as they move through the supply chain. So in some cases, lobster, salmon, snapper can be included here. What's really interesting though is this is a spectrum. So in the case of lobster, for example, you might have a fisher who is selling lobster into one supply chain, and then that product gets split. And on one pathway, it goes to local high-end restaurants and is served as a very premium differentiated product. And half of that same product might then go to a distributor who actually sells it into a restaurant chain where all distinguishing features are lost and it winds up as a commodity product. So this is a very fluid spectrum and the lines are not very distinct. And so you can have one product wind as both a commodity or as highly differentiated. So again, it's part of the complexity that we have to deal with in trying to understand where these products go and how they're treated. So the second attribute is brand presence. And this is all about how much influence a particular company or strong brand might have. And the presence of a strong brand can work to drive changes in practice throughout a supply chain. And this influence can kind of happen in two directions. The first can be top down, and that's what you see on the left-hand side where you see Walmart. This begins with the actions of an end buyer, such as a powerful buyer like a Walmart, but it can also come from a value-added processor. It can come from a broker, a certification standard setter, but it can also come bottom up. And this fish is an example of this. This is a company that is an initiative of eco-trust, and they work directly with the fishers to brand specific products and try to force and work upwards through the supply chain from a more grassroots kind of orientation. NGOs have also done this with examples being Gulf Wild or even fishing cooperatives, such as the work being done with Alaska Gold. But the idea here is that the specifications of a particular brand, they can be based on location or quality, but these specifications must be met by all the other players in the supply chain in order for them to be able to play, be able to trade that product. And so a supply chain player might have a direct or indirect relationship with the brand. It might be an exclusive market channel or just one of many. But depending on what that relationship looks like and how influential that brand can be, working with one of these kind of companies or a supply chain with a strong brand presence can be a very effective way of creating change. All right, so relationship dynamics. These come in sort of three basic forms. In the seafood industry, relationships do tend to be long-lasting, and they're built on trust, especially at the beginning of the supply chain between fishers and their buyers. So if we look at relationship number one, this is a harmonious, very equal relationship between, say, an artisanal fisher and their buyer. There's often a personal connection. Sometimes that middleman or buyer can be providing more than just the trade in seafood. Often they'll be providing loans and other services. And if this is a beneficial relationships, a trusted relationship, it can work really, really well. And working with one or both of those players can provide great influence in the supply chain. But that relationship can also be exploitative. And that's where we see number two, where you have one of the players, which tends to be the middleman, pressing down on the fisher. And they have that close tie works negatively in the sense that the fisher is often disempowered. And so figuring out how to work around that kind of dynamic requires a different intervention strategy. And then in the third instance, you have much more distance relationships. They tend to have little personal investment and are much more business oriented. And they may not have, one player may not have much influence over the other if this relationship is more distant. So the extent that a trading partner relationship is healthy and the product can be differentiated to some degree, those close ties can be very flexible and potentially open to implementing changes that could benefit long-term sustainability. But in situations where the relationships are weak or more fluid, and thus the trading partners aren't as tied to one another, it can be hard sometimes to drive influence or for that influence to spread across different partners in the supply chain because of the lack of connectivity. Okay, the next attribute is the supply chain consolidation. And the difference here is, if you look at the colors of each of the circles under vertically integrated, all the colors are the same. And this is meant to represent the fact that one company actually owns all the different businesses in this supply chain. So they own the boats, they own the processors, they own the distributors, and all the way up. Whereas on the right side, under the dispersed supply chain, you have all different actors, all different kinds of companies, independently owned and operated, that are working together as trading partners. Many seafood supply chains are vertically integrated. So all these functions fall under a single company ownership. And this can bring lots of benefits to that company. It can help guarantee access to product. It protects the company from a lot of price volatility. It allows for very close quality and inventory control. If that company is interested in the mission of sustainability, they can be a fantastic leverage point to change. If they're not, they can be a huge block, right? So it just depends on their orientation. And so again, figuring out which of these companies, which of these supply chains are vertically integrated versus not can help inform your strategy there. With dispersed chains, it is more difficult to create change because no one actor has major influence. When there are short chains, it can be possible to engage all the actors simultaneously and try to work with them collaboratively and cooperatively to influence change. But if it's a long and dispersed change, it's going to be much more difficult to do that. So again, understanding sort of what that challenge looks like and the degree of that challenge is important before you're crafting any intervention strategies. And the final key attribute is market access. So depending on the type of product and the location of the fishery, there may be a series of middlemen or aggregators that commingle product for a single processor or distributor. And they sort of are the gatekeepers. So this is what you see on the left-hand side, where the fisher has to go through one entity in order for their product to reach the market. In the middle, there might be the opportunity where there might only be one or two middlemen or buyers, but the fisher actually can go around them. And if the fisher wants, they can go through to the market themselves directly. And in the third situation, you have a fisher who has multiple options, and there's actually different middlemen who are competing for that product. And this actually empowers the fisher and gives a little bit more ability for them to make choice and to negotiate contracts. So each of these presents a different power dynamic based on how much access the fisher actually has and the product has to that market. So again, understanding what that structure looks like in your particular supply chain is important in terms of what kinds of strategies are going to be most effective. So just to recap really quickly, these are the key attributes that we think are really important to keep track of and to investigate when you're thinking about engaging a supply chain. So it's the type of the product, the brand presence, relationship dynamics, supply chain consolidation, and market access. All right. So we have key attributes, and we also have some core challenges. And I'm not going to go through all of these today because, again, it's all in the report, and that would be a lot of information to download at once. But through the research and interviews that we did with the TNC network, we found about 9 core challenges that are seemingly blocking progress towards greater sustainability. And I am going to highlight, by looking at some specific case studies now, some of these core challenges, and we'll also talk about some of the key strategies that seem to be able to overcome them. But just really quickly, the 9 challenges, it's lack of vessel level data capture. So this means that at the very first point in the supply chain, when the fisher lands a product, there's no accurate recording of the information about what that product is, where it came from, how it was caught. Product transformation prior to data recording. So this means that the product is processed in some form before any information, again, has been captured. We've talked a little bit about aggregation of supply. So this is where product from different fishers, different regions is brought together, and the distinguishing information about origin is lost. Talked a little bit about this challenges that some of the relationship dynamics can present. Another core challenge is that fishers typically aren't business people. And what's meant by this is that fishers know how to fish. They are very good at what they do, but they aren't necessarily marketers or finance experts or have the expertise or access to resources that they need to promote their product or to figure out how to work in the marketplace in a way that could bring some benefit. There are cultural preferences that can serve as roadblocks. There's lack of monitoring and enforcement. There's also lack of database and data management capacity. So sometimes the information is being captured in the supply chain or by the fisher, but there's nowhere to put it and nowhere to store it and have it be readily accessible by those who need to use that data. And then there's the interrelatedness of the challenges. And again, this goes back to the systems lens, which is that each of these core challenges actually does relate to the other. And there's no one way to solve a particular challenge in thinking that that's going to unlock the whole system. We've really got to look across all of these different challenges and see how they're pressing and interrelated in order for us to be able to make great change. So as an example, the Vietnamese blue swimmer crab serves to show some of the issues with lack of vessel level data capture and product transformation. So this is a highly overfished commodity product, and it has a huge demand from an export market, particularly in the US. And the process by which this product is harvested is the fishers bring the product to land at the beach, or sometimes a collector boat collects product from the different fishers from different boats. And then the primary processing actually occurs right on the beach, where they cook and grade the product, and sometimes the picking occurs there as well. At this point, there is some data collection because this fishery is, some of them are trying to be as part of a FIP. So there's some minor data collection here, but it's happened after the processing. Secondary processing then happens in a plant with pasteurization and the packaging. And then the distribution can be local, but again, is in particular to an export market. And the real kicker in this fishery is that compensation is on a per unit basis. So there's very little incentive to discriminate between fishers that are bringing in juvenile crabs versus adult. Because once the product is transformed, again, once it's cooked and picked, it's nearly impossible to know where that crab came from and who that crab came from. So enforcement of the size regulations is a huge challenge. So these are the problems sort of facing this particular case. And I wanted to show in contrast how these core challenges sort of manifest in different fisheries. So this is all the way on the other side of the world in Bahamian conch, totally different fishery than the blue swimming crab, but we see very similar core challenges emerging. And here we have that the fisher lands a conch, but because the conch shell is so heavy and cumbersome, they actually take the meat out of the shell and discard the shell while at sea, so that only the meat is landed. And the issue here is that it is from the shell that regulators and fisheries managers are able to tell whether or not that conch was mature and of the right size. So again, we have a loss of information that's critical for fisheries management right at the beginning of the supply chain. After the meat is landed, the fisher then sells directly to a local market and restaurant, and often there's no record here because it's just door to door, or again, informal. The fisher may sell to one of 9 processors who then export to the US. And the export market here is actually very highly regulated because conch is regulated under CITES. So in this case, we have a pretty well-known export market and an almost complete black box for the domestic market. So it's a really interesting challenge, but again, a different fishery, but some of those same core challenges are emerging. And another example of the way that these core challenges can manifest, we can see in the Indonesian deepwater snapper fishery. And this is one that TNC has been working on as well. So many of these, I should have said at the beginning, case studies come from work that TNC is doing directly in the field. And we really appreciate all the insight that the different researchers and managers have given us as we worked through this. But a large number of the species, there's a large number of species in this fishery, and there's poor species identification. There was no real fisheries level data collection. There's very numerous ports of landing and aggregation of the supply at different stages, and all of this has made management really, really challenging in this fishery. So we have the lack of the vessel level data capture, product transformation issues, aggregation of the supply. We also see here in this fishery that fishers typically aren't business people, that this comes up as a challenge in that they are not able to market their product in the way that they'd like or differentiate their product in the way that they'd like. And then a major lack of the database and data management capacity in this instance. And then the final case study, just showing again a few of the other core challenges in effect, come from the Peruvian multi-species fishery. And here, there's some similar ones to what we've seen before, but we also see that there are some new ones. In particular, cultural preferences plays a big role here. So depending on the species that's caught, they can be mid-value, considered mid-value, and that's the crabs or snails, or very high value, such as octopus or the silverside products. The main fishing grounds is in a multi-use marine protected area, but there's no management plan. And in this fishery, we see that relationship dynamics and some of the cultural sensitivities are really key. So what are known as the jaladores and the first buyers are often related to the divers and the fishers. So that they're often considered like family if they're not directly family. And so oftentimes we saw examples where the first buyer is even the godmother for say the fisher. So working with the close relationship dynamics here, as well as some of the cultural issues, is really key. We saw examples, again, where if someone in, say, the fisher's family is sick, they'll go to their buyer, to that middleman, to get the medicine. So these are very close relationships that hold a lot of importance, and knowing how to work with that can be a challenge, but also an opportunity. So, thinking of opportunities, there are some strategies out there that can help overcome some of these challenges. And while this, again, is a very nascent field, we were really impressed with the scope and diversity of some of the different kinds of interventions and initiatives that we've already seen in development. And again, a lot of you folks I know on the line today have been working actively in this space for several years and have come up with some wonderful approaches and really great steps to progress. So based on all of the different interventions that we saw, we were able to distill about 8 emergent strategies for progress that we think can help guide successful work in the supply chain. And these include, they're listed here on the left, and I'll show how they manifest in 2 of the case studies that I just went through. But just to go over them really quickly, they identify who holds the power. So again, we talked a little bit about this with the brand present attribute, but as in the case with any group of people in many supply chains, some players hold disproportionate influence over others. And identifying who those individuals are and how they can benefit from a conservation-aligned initiative, it can be a very powerful approach to engaging a supply chain. Proving the concept is that, industry is understandably hesitant to engage in initiatives or pilots, especially when it comes to collecting and sharing data. So one way to build trust is to start small, make the ask small, but also make sure that you're able to show the reward, and make sure that the reward is relevant to the business. So show the value of participating to the one player, and maybe that one player then can become an ally that can help you expand to others. We've talked already about aligning with existing cultural values, but it's really important when engaging in supply chain to understand the value structure that exists. Providing evidence of progress. So both fishers and supply chain players, they want to see that things are working. They want to see that the sacrifices and changes they're making are creating results. So the more that you can structure an initiative to be able to show those results quickly, even thinking about what kind of species you want to engage with, what kind of metrics you're going to set up, is really important. There are initiatives out there that have enabled well-designed alternative livelihoods. So where you're asking a business or a fisher especially to change practice, where they may lose some income, being able to supplement that is critically important. Teaming up, finding local partners, finding who your allies are within the supply chain, but also outside. So whether it's cooperatives or other industry groups that can help you, is a great strategy. We've talked about branding the local product, and then also letting fishers and industry lead. So the idea here is to really co-design with the practitioners in the field, respect their expertise and their leadership, and try to facilitate interventions that allow them to be making decisions and taking the lead, so that they feel empowered and that they also feel responsible and engaged in the process. So an example of this, we can see in the Indonesian deepwater snapper, where TNC has been actively working, led by Peter Mouse's group. And they worked there to identify one processor who was willing to engage with them in terms of changing some of the practices within his operations. They also worked with a technology traceability company to develop smart technology that allowed for better species identification, more efficient weighing of the fish and barcoding, all of these things that allowed for the data to be more accurate and to flow more readily. This information has brought business wins to that processor, but it's also allowed TNC to filter really critical fisheries data to fisheries management bodies so that they can improve the stock assessments, and it's leading to some pretty great results. There've already been agreement among some buyers to increase the minimum of some of the species that they're catching, and all of this has worked to help prove to other processors in the region that engagement in this kind of improved traceability technology and working with TNC has business wins as well as the environmental side. So this is a great case where identifying who holds the power and proving that concept has worked really well to help start to scale some of the results there. I know I'm getting close on time here, so really quickly, in the Peruvian multi-species fishery, I just wanted to highlight that TNC again has been working extensively here to make sure that they're aligned with the existing cultural values and take advantage of the location-specific aspect of where they're working. So compared to sort of some of the neighboring countries such as Chile, there's some big differences in the way that fishers view themselves and their work. And so that some of the strategies that have worked nearby are really not deemed practical for the Peru region. And instead, TNC has been working really closely with fishers there to take advantage of the fact that fishers have very strong local pride as a value that can be leveraged in terms of them being able to take care of their resource, and have them sort of unite around a local branding campaign. The area where they work is highly regarded as a historic fishing area, and there are local markets that are very interested in being able to have specific product. So TNC is working to figure out how they can leverage some of these values and some of this local branding effort to bring some benefits back to the fishers, and it's working pretty well. Okay, so to recap, these are the 8 strategies. Again, there's many more details in the report, and we call these emergent strategies for progress because, again, they are nascent, they are still being explored, still being refined, but we think that they offer some great seeds for development in terms of looking for how to engage in supply chains. And in terms of having a bit of a guide, in the report you'll see that there is a table, and we walk through how to consider the different key attributes of your supply chain, the regulatory structure that surrounds it, the different values as well as market access, and some of the known obstacles, and looking through all of those different components to try to then say, okay, what strategies make sense, or what strategies have been used in these different case studies, so that you all can kind of start to compare and contrast the supply chains that we've been able to look at and understand the similarities and differences to the supply chains where you may be working, and draw from the experience of your peers and some of the work that's been moved forward in order to try to start to craft strategies that have the best chance for being effective in your particular situation. So that was a lot of content. Again, it is all written down in the report and available to you all. And I would just like to say that in terms of the next steps, in the report, again, you'll find there's more insights. There's some guides to engagement. There's a glossary of terms, which we hope you will find helpful. And we really, really encourage participation and active engagement in this space. We are, at Future of Fish, continuing to research and try to uncover more strategies, refine these strategies, and are eager to work with more partners in the field so that we can continue to move this space forward, so that we can help all of you practitioners who are out there on the ground doing the hard blood, sweat, and tears of your work every day, be able to be as effective as possible and find the ways of really helping to engage supply chains for conservation and fisheries wins as much as we can. So with that, I will stop talking and really welcome questions and your insights so that we can move the conversation forward. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mara. That was really, like you said, a lot of great info, and I'm excited that we have the guide to share with people, but we already have some questions coming in. So right now is the question portion of the webinar. So remember, you can either raise your hand or use the question box to chat your question in, and I'll go ahead and ask Mara to respond, and Jeremy as well if he has any comments. So the first question I have is, what kind of incentives have been offered to the fishery industry to change their practice? So specifically a little more detail on the types of incentives that you mentioned, I think, is what the question is looking for answers for.
Right. Yeah. So there are different kinds out there, and again, it what counts as an incentive varies greatly across different fisheries. Um, some of the incentives that tend to work or are trying to be worked on include things like more guaranteed market access. So this is where buyers will agree to, for example, buy a certain quantity of fish from a fisher ahead of time. So things like forward contracts that can help stabilize, the fisher's income so that they know what they're going to get. It also helps stabilize the price for the buyer. So this is something that has been experimented with in the past. And in fact, Keith Flett, who works with us at Fisheries and sort of leads our business sector, is an expert in this particular area. Price premiums are harder. It's very difficult for those to filter down to the fishers. But now that fair trade has started to engage with seafood, that's one channel where we do see some of the first experiments that are, trying to guarantee that premium does reach fishers, or at least fisher co-ops. So that's a really interesting model. Market access. So some of the incentive can just be that by shifting behaviors, fishers are able to sell their product into markets that they otherwise wouldn't. And this can be everything from, certification, which, is a certain kind of market, but then also like in the Peruvian multi-species fishery we were talking about, if they're able to brand that their fish is really coming from Ancon, then there are restaurants and sort of high-end markets in Lima that want that local regional fish for it, specifically. So being able to work to change the behaviors and change some of the practices to show that it's sustainable, but also to prove the locality are ways in which fishers may gain new types of market access that they wouldn't have otherwise. So those are 3 examples, and there are many, many others. And when it comes to creative financing, when it comes to storytelling, there's a whole range of ideas and opportunities that are out there that we're trying to work to develop. But it is difficult kind of to paint with a broad brush because, again, so much of this depends on the culture and the structure of the specific supply chain in terms of what is going to motivate that fisher and what is going to motivate that fisher in a way that brings alignment with the sustainability goals.
Okay, well, thanks. So another question is, do you see any difference in outcomes or success based on the strength of the fisheries management that's in a certain or in a specific place?
It's a fantastic question, and it's one that I hesitate to answer at this point because I don't think we have quite enough data yet. But what we did with this report as sort of a first start was that is definitely an important component. And what we'd really like to do is be able to do a little bit more, gather a few more case studies and do a little bit more comparison to see, what degree the current management, strength and status has in terms of influencing these outcomes. I do think it's an important factor. That said, there are some examples where fisheries that don't have strong fisheries management and don't have great stock assessments or capacity in place are working with the supply chains specifically to address that issue. So again, the work that Peter Mouse is doing in Indonesia is a great example of that. The deep water fishery there had very little information. It was very data poor. And so with little capacity for the government to be able to figure out how to change that. And so by engaging with the supply chain, they're now able to feed that information back. So I think the management status is going to be a really important factor to consider. But I think that I can't say, whether stronger management means it's easier to engage the supply chain or not at this time. Jeremy, I don't know if you have any insight there or thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, my answer would have been similar. I think that there are instances on both sides where you can see that in places where there is a weak governance capacity, you can still see supply chain engagement that has had fantastic outcomes, and then vice versa. But I think that we're still needing to have a few more case studies to know that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, thanks to both of you. So another question is, which one of the key attributes that you described do you think has the most weight or might be the hardest to break through?
It's a good question. I think, again, it's more a question of the combination of those attributes. So there's different strategies that can be employed to address the different types of attributes that are going on. So if you have a commodity product versus a differentiated product, it doesn't mean that that one versus the other is going to be easier to deal with. It really just depends on how you're going to deal with it. What you want is to make sure that you design an intervention that works with the type of product. You don't want to use an intervention that works well for a differentiated product if your supply chain is handling commodity product, right? So in terms of that level of the key attributes, it's really just about understanding what you're working with. Across the board, if, and this is a big if you have a really highly vertically integrated supply chain that's short with a mission-driven company at the helm, it is going to be far easier to move the needle on change, right? But again, that same company and that same supply chain structure might have a company that has no interest whatsoever in sustainability, in which case then that becomes really difficult to move. So it's really hard to say, which of these attributes to focus on or which aspects of the attributes is, the most powerful lever. I think the idea here is to understand that each of these attributes are something to look for and understand before you engage, so that you can craft your strategy appropriately. That said, I think from experience and from what we've seen, the relationship dynamics piece, so the key attribute around relationships dynamics, is really, really important. It permeates everything. Understanding who and how these players are related to each other, and who holds the power, who holds the influence, and what the nature of that relationship looks like is critical for how the initial steps in terms of who you reach out to engage, and also the type of strategy that you're going to be looking at. Because that's all about, again, understanding whose behavior you're trying to shift.
Great.
So I know that's not much of an answer.
No, I think it's helpful. So I think one final question before we wrap up today, kind of following along the lines of the question you just were answering, from a manager or an NGO perspective, trying to kind of look at projects that are moving forward this newer field, what types of resources, skills, and time commitment should they be kind of thinking about as they start jumping into a project maybe focused on that? And I know that's really hard depending on the scale, but a lot of things are a question of time and capacity. And so what should managers or those that support managers be aware of as if they're thinking about doing projects related to this?
It's a really great question. And I think that it's another aspect that we would like to build out. So I'm thinking, it would be great, and we didn't really ask specifically, but again, with the Reef Resilience Network as such a great resource, I would love to hear from folks like, Peter Mouse and Felicity in the Bahamas, like how much time they have spent on some of these projects, and how much of their work is engaged here. many resources what kind of resources are going into this in a way that's a little bit more, I guess, quantitative.
Mhm.
I can't give a good answer. What I can say is that what's really important is building trust. Especially because the industry tends to be hesitant to make change. It just is. It's a slow beast to move. And again, these ideas of proving the concept, being able to show progress, all take, it's pretty high touch. You have to be working to build that relationship, to show that you're genuine in caring about the business's perspective. And that takes, personal conversations, it takes meetings, and it takes investment in building that relationship. That said, once the trust is there and once some of these things can be proven, sometimes it can be, pretty fast moving. Businesses, if they see that something works and brings them benefit, they can adopt things quite quickly. And then they can, that word can spread quite quickly. So I would say my gut is that it's a fairly heavy lift at the beginning, with hopefully kind of a ramped up process as things move along. But I think it really takes a shift in how we think about what does it mean to be engaging in fisheries conservation management. That supply chains have been left out of that conversation for a really long time and left out of the initiatives. So thinking about how do we make it so that that's a component that can be continually worked on and is part of these programs, I think is something really worth considering, and something that I think I would love to hear more from all of you practitioners who have been engaging in this, what that looks like and how it's taxed your own programs, and what kind of staffing resources you've needed, and what that actually looks like. That's an area that we're looking to really learn more about.
Great. Well, I'm sorry, but I have to wrap up our question and answer session. Our time is up for today, but we encourage all participants to continue this conversation on the Reef Resilience discussion forum. If you're not already a member of the forum, it's really easy to get on. You just go to reefresilience.org and register, and you submit a little registration form, you get approved, and then you'll be in the forum, and you can post a question, and Mara's offered to check it and answer questions if people had remaining questions from this webinar. And if you want to continue some of that conversation or let her know about the resources, if you've worked on these projects, you're welcome to share that within the forum. Because we definitely know that this is a really interesting topic for managers, and we'll continue to try to support that conversation through the network. We want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thanks to Mara for the great presentation, and to our guest host, Jeremy. And then the recording of this webinar is going to be sent out to the network email list in the next couple days. If you're not on that list and you'd like to be, just email us at resilience@tnc.org. We should be having another webinar in another month or so on coral reef restoration in the Western Indian Ocean, so stay tuned for the announcement on that. And thanks again for your participation. Have a great day.
Thanks so much for having me.